Hi. So we're about to start the panel discussion for today, and just so we are 3 minutes live so that people can join us virtually. So we cannot take a moment and share the live streaming. His name is Concordia African Elections Roundtable. Spotlight on we cannot share. Thank you. We welcome everybody to today's session. So we are happy that you have been able to join us here for today's panel. It is undeniable that the 2017 elections in Kenya was one of the most painful political processes that have been in Africa for the year underway. And it is our hope that this roundtable will provide us a platform to interrogate this event or this process and to make sense of the various events that took place throughout the election hearing process. And we are also thankful for our esteemed panelists who are going to take time with their busy schedules to join us and to speak to us on this. Especially many people are our guest panelists who are coming from outside of Concordia. So Professor Erlich is coming from McGill University, and Professor Cheeseman is coming from Concordia to join us this morning. Just as a way of introduction, our panel is often consists of Professor Leander, Schneider, seated right on the left. He's one of our resident professors here at the Political Science Department, an Africanist who has written on Tanzanian elections for the Jacobin magazine. We also have next to him is Professor Erlich. She's also one of the resident professors in the department here and an Africanist as well. Professor Poteete's work on African elections has focused on Senegal and Botswana. It has appeared in leading journals like the Journal of Modern African Studies, Electoral Studies, and she has a forthcoming article in the African Affairs Journal. Next to Professor Poteete is Professor McGill. He's a professor of democracy and international development at the University of Birmingham. Professor Cheeseman is the leading authority on democracy and elections in sub-Saharan Africa. He's the author of Democracy in Africa, Successes, Failures, and the Struggle for Political Reform, and numerous articles on elections. His forthcoming book is entitled How to Rig an Election. And that is
another reason this year.
Okay, so his other book is
Skim it. Right now we're live streaming back up to the world.
Institutions and Democracy in Africa, How the Rules of the Game Shape Political Development. We can all take a break. Alright. And then seated next to him is Professor Erlich. He's a professor at the Political Science Department at McGill University. Among other topics, Professor Erlich works on democratization and election fraud. His article on election management in Kenya has appeared in the Journal of Modern African Studies. Also, he's done work for the National Democratization Institute in Nairobi, Kenya. Now, just so you know how the organization for today's panel is, so we're going to proceed in this manner. First, to be speaking to us will be Professor Schneider, who will speak on the dynamics of elections, the conduct of elections in sub-Saharan Africa in general, to provide a more general continental context for this discussion. After that, Professor Poteete's presentation will provide a specific context for the 2017 elections in Kenya. We will then turn to Professor Erlich, who will speak on specific themes like the issue of incompetence versus fraud, primaries and MP campaigning, and public opinion. Among that. Then we will then turn the floor to Professor Cheeseman, who will speak to the other thematic areas of provenance on the Kenyan elections, including the nature of the presidential coalition building, impacts of election technology, and prospects for democratization among others. So thereafter, we will open the floor for the Q&A and interactions on general. So without much further delay, I want to turn the floor to Professor to begin.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Thanks for the audience for leading this such a worthwhile event. It's great that you have such a good turn. So I thought, oh, that's not quite the effect that everybody's retreating. At any rate, I thought it might be useful to start us out with just providing a bit of a broad historical and conceptual matrix of what we have been talking about today in the African continent. A lot of you have been in our classes on African politics. I thought that might be useful to set a broader historical context and talk a little bit about the kind of bigger debates that have been revolving around elections and the idea of democracy that are, of course, tied to that. So on the premise that an animated atlas speaks louder than any words, I thought I'd pull this one up. It maps sub-Saharan Africa according to the political regimes that are in place in these various places. Currently, we're sitting in 1976. It's noticeable that there are only a few specks on the African continent, Botswana, Senegal, Madagascar, that are showing in this saturated pea green, signaling that we have multi-party competitions in these countries. So the 1960s, 1970s, into the 1980s are not the heyday of multi-party democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. There are a few countries that achieve multi-party democracy, some of them under quite restrictive conditions, such as Senegal during this period. And if we are taking the browser and we're shifting this forward, we're seeing 1970, 1982, 85. I'm going to stop it at 1989. Still, most of the continent dominated by regimes that either don't conduct elections with competitive parties, so one-party regimes, or military regimes. 1 year further down the line, 1990, and suddenly sub-Saharan Africa is beginning to turn pea green. 91, even yet more, if I may focus you on Kenya, since that's our title for today. Right up here, the year when multi-party elections are arriving in Kenya in 91, 92, 92, 93, 94, and we are now looking at a continent that within the span of 4 years has essentially flipped from single-party military regimes to some form of multi-party electoral democracy. And with this, we have reached the end of history, or at least more or less the end of what the historical atlas will tell us about democracy in Africa. So if you're talking about democracy, if you're talking about regime types in Africa, this at the time was of course hailed as a major wave of democratization, maybe a fourth wave of democratization in sub-Saharan Africa. We have achieved multi-party elections, and therefore we have achieved democratization in sub-Saharan Africa. And subsequently, we've learned that that's a picture that, of course, a great deal more complicated. It maybe makes sense to back up a touch and ask, well, what are elections really supposed to get you? And why are we linking multi-party elections in particular to democratization? Elections are supposed to be a mechanism through which governments are held accountable by the governed. And they are a mechanism through which differences in society and decisions over who ought to govern are supposed to be reached via peaceable, well-organized, regular means, that of the ballot box. So two expectations tied to elections: accountability and peaceable means for conducting the political affairs of the country. And on both these counts, the more recent history has really put a big question mark over this idea that the achievement of multi-party elections equals the achievement of democratization. Which is why we are today no longer talking about that transition of the unidirectional thing, but we are debating consolidation. And here, elections fit into the picture of democratization in much more complicated ways. Elections can sometimes be the kind of mechanism that we expected them to be, holding governments accountable, but doing so through peaceful means. They are sometimes manipulated to such an extent that accountability isn't really the result of holding elections. And Professor Cheeseman has written a book on how to rig them. So if you are interested in a manual of how to curtail accountability in the context of multi-party elections, this is a book to read. And in other contexts, and especially where the stakes in elections seem to be particularly high, elections have also triggered conflict. They have served as a flashpoint. They have deteriorated. They have led to the deterioration of the political situation in a number of countries. Just let me flip through today's headline from the Guardian newspaper. I wanted to have this. Today's headline from the Guardian newspaper that has now disappeared on us, but will appear. Sierra Leone, violence fears. Tense elections reach a runoff. Being one of the examples of elections that might not be providing a peaceable means for resolving disagreements and conflict, but might be in fact a point, a flashpoint, a point around which conflict galvanizes. Which brings us to the Kenyan elections and to Kenyan electoral history more generally. Kenya has been one of these cases where there's been a dance back and forth between movements toward consolidation of democracy, elections serving that particular goal, but elections also being manipulated through ballot box stuffing, through beating up on the opposition, through various other means that are supposed to curtail accountability. Kenya has also, most noticeably in 2007, and the fears were again last year, served as an example of how elections can serve as a trigger point for violence, particularly where the stakes are high. Where elections seem to be focusing the minds on the stakes, on what happens when you lose, and therefore maybe contribute more to winner-takes-all type politics in which losing is not an option, and cannot be an option, than to the peaceful resolution of political disagreements. That makes the Kenyan example so interesting. It makes the Kenyan example worth examining. With this, I'll be handing over to Dr. Poteete, who's going to be giving us a bit more background on electoral dynamics in Kenya before we handing over to our Kenya specialists.
I'm not sure what's happening with it. I had some maps and some things like cartoons and things like that. But I can talk in any case. So what I see my task here is doing is providing some background on Kenya in case some of you in the audience don't know much about the country to begin with. I want to start off by highlighting just some general themes about the country that will be coming up in terms of the political lines of division or issues. So the first thing to know is that Kenya is a multi-ethnic country in which there's no one group that is the largest group. So you've got a kind of medium-sized group, and then you've got several smaller groups. So those groups overlap with particular regions within the country. So a lot of the political divisions will have an ethnic overtone to them. And the numbers of putting together coalitions have to do also with putting together ethnic coalitions. Related to these issues has been an ongoing debate about centralization and decentralization, with debates about the configuration of the regions or the subunits within the country, the degree of autonomy to be provided to these various subunits is an ongoing fate in the country. Another topic that has been of ongoing concern has been corruption. Kenya regularly features among the countries in the African continent that has a serious problem with corruption. Corruption is widespread in Africa in general, but is particularly noted as being prominent in Kenya. That carries over into the electoral arena, with issues of electoral fraud being a regular feature of elections in Kenya. And not only do we have fraud, but we also have issues of violence. So it gets to the point where some degree of violence associated with the elections is almost to be expected, and the question then becomes sort of the scale and severity of the violence rather than whether there will be violence. Okay, so those are some themes. Now I want to quickly go over some of the key dates. So Kenya gained independence in 1964. It was initially a multi-party system. That did not last very long, so very quickly went to a one-party system. It remained as a one-party system until 1991, as has already been highlighted in the previous presentation. When the multi-party elections were introduced in the 1990s, it did not mean that there was an electoral turnover. So the president at the time, Daniel Arap Moi, he, his party KANU, the Kenyan African National Union, they remained dominant, a dominant political force. Moi had resisted democratization. There was a quote, I could not find this quote, there's some quote that's up there, where he was basically saying that democratization would be like opening the doors to shrieking birds or wild animals or something like this. He was making the case, which is a very self-serving argument, but nonetheless, he was making the argument that allowing multi-party elections could be a real threat to the cohesion of Kenya as a country because of the multi-ethnic nature of the country. His argument was that if you have multi-party elections, those divisions would be manifested in the different political parties, and it would reinforce the ethnic divisions rather than bringing the country together. So this was one of the arguments against it, but nonetheless, given the move across the continent around the world towards multi-party elections at that time, quite considerable international pressure, there was a decision to open things up. But the first two multi-party elections, 1992 and 1997, Moi won, and KANU won. They did put, when they changed things to allow multi-party elections, a term limit was put in place. And so after 1997, you could not run for re-election again. The current president was actually kind of the named successor of Moi, is the son of the first president. So the first president was Jomo Kenyatta. Moi came in after Kenyatta had died. The current president is Uhuru Kenyatta. Now, Kenyatta did not come to power, though, immediately after Moi's term. So the next elections were 2002. Actually, KANU split over the designation of Kenyatta, and probably some other issues as well, as the successor. So it split, and so one of the breakaway groups went with some of the opposition folks, and they won the elections. That was in 2002. Then we get the 2007 elections, which, as my colleague Professor Schneider has already indicated, were violence had been there. As I said, Moi had said that elections raised the risk of more ethnic violence and division. He and his party had fomented that sort of violence at every election as sort of a mobilizing device, and also to suppress votes in areas that he saw as opposition votes. But in the 2007 elections, the severity of the conflicts really ballooned up. The 2007 elections, it was not yet the two who are there now. So we had Raila Odinga, who we'll see as one of the two current key figures, and the person who had succeeded Moi, which was Mwai Kibaki. So those two were standing off with each other, but Uhuru by this time had joined Kibaki's team. Okay, so we have Uhuru Kenyatta is in his team. So those two are together, and then we have Raila Odinga, and they're mobilizing people in ways that turn into violence. So when I talk about violence here, I'm going to read a quote. Okay, this is from the International Criminal Court, which got involved with this. They had a report available online that says the prosecutor contended that over 1,000 people were killed. There were over 900 acts of documented rape and sexual violence. Approximately 350,000 people were displaced, and over 3,500 were seriously injured. So the severity of the conflict was the violence that broke out during the elections, but especially after the elections, when Kibaki was declared to have won, and this was rejected by many people as being blatantly fraudulent. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that this was in fact a stolen election. A lot of evidence. I think, personally, I'm convinced that it was a stolen election. So there was an eruption of violence with both sides involved in the violence. You had people in civil society, the media, international community really concerned that this could be forget about democracy. There are concerns that the country could extend into civil violence and just civil war. And given that there are a number of countries in the region that have in fact broken down into civil war, this was not a crazy idea. However, in this situation, rather than descend into civil war, there were negotiations encouraged again by international actors and civil society. And those negotiations led to a variety of changes, including constitutional change. So the current elections that played out were playing out under new constitutional arrangements that were adopted. Let me see here, it was in 2010, the referendum was approved. So from the negotiations, a coalition government was formed. Odinga was in as prime minister. This was kind of his, to get him involved and to help push down the violence. He was brought into the coalition. We get this referendum, it decentralized, we changed the configuration of the country. This is where I wanted to have the map. Let's just say broke it down into smaller units, the different material units. And it set the new rules for the presidential elections. So the current election played out under these rules. To win the elections, the candidate has to have greater than 50% of the vote nationally, and they have to have greater than 25% of the vote in 24 of the 47 counties. If those conditions don't hold, then there's going to be a great runoff. Okay? So the next elections were held under those rules, and that's when Uhuru Kenyatta becomes the president. He was declared the winner with 50.07% vote, according to statistics back then. So just by having that 50.07, he was able to avoid the runoff. He also had the distribution of the party. So then we have another period of time comes, and we get to the current elections, which were initially held on August 8, 2017. Their official results here were 54% for Uhuru Kenyatta and 44% for Raila Odinga. As has become almost customary, these results were rejected by Odinga. It's like you have the election is deemed to be fraudulent, the losing candidate says they were fraudulent, they reject the results. They went to the courts, which has happened time and again. The great surprise was that this time the courts actually said, you know, right, once you actually have demonstrated that there were serious procedural problems with these elections and we're going to annul them, the new constitution stipulates that under those circumstances, fresh elections must be held within 60 days. It's a revote. I said fresh elections the first time, but really it's a revote. So because it's a revote, it's the same set of candidates. This was actually a matter of considerable confusion and dispute in the country about whether it should be the same set of candidates. The courts ruled it needed to be the same set of candidates. I'm sure that everybody's on board with that interpretation, but that is the interpretation that the court came to. There were serious problems with trying to do a revote in 60 days, as you might imagine. A lot of the problems have been attributed to problems with the Electoral Commission. Okay? The same Electoral Commission is there, and whereas previously they had been preparing for, I don't know, something like 70 months, and here they're trying to prepare for these elections in a period of 60 days, in a context where a lot of demands were being made, and they were just not dealing. There were also efforts to change the electoral rules and all sorts of things that were happening between the decision of the court and the eventual elections. So the real elections were held 26 October. Under circumstances in which there were court cases again, Odinga had decided that the procedural problems, the inability to get agreements with the Electoral Commission determination on a variety of changes were so severe that he was going to boycott the election to withdraw his name, with the hope, I think, that that would trigger a further delay in the process. However, that didn't happen. There were other efforts legally to try to postpone the elections. That did not happen either. In fact, one of the cases, a last-minute case, was not heard, in part because there was a last-minute declaration of a public holiday. And even though the High Court Justice, or whatever the label is, said that they should go ahead, nobody was present. So, so they had that, and then the results were that basically Kenyatta got 98% of the vote with the boycott. Okay, so there were ongoing. So Odinga says he doesn't accept that. He was calling on people to mobilize. There was again an ongoing process of there was legal challenges. Again, the legal challenges didn't go anywhere this time. So although the first election was canceled, this one was not. In January, as a kind of demonstration of ongoing rejection of the results, Odinga organized an alternative inauguration where he declared himself or he had himself inaugurated as the people's president. This led to a further crackdown. The most recent development is that, so that was 30 January. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a surprise announcement that the two principals involved, so Odinga and Kenyatta, had a deal, and that they're now going to go into a process of reconciliation, which I don't know a whole lot about. So I hope I haven't stepped on what other people are going to say, but what I wanted to do here is to provide you with these key dates and these key developments along the way, so that these two can come in and get into more nitty-gritty, interesting debates when they can draw on their knowledge about those areas. You know, I hope I have done that well.
So we now thank Professor Erlich.
Thanks very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. There's a lot can be said here, and it's potentially a little unclear what the right thing to say is, but I'm going to want to make a couple of larger points about things that have actually stayed the same over time in the Kenyan elections. And then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Cheeseman, who actually knows a lot more than me, and to talk a little bit more about the most recent developments. In terms of my background, I actually was not as involved in these most recent elections, though I did spend a lot of time in Kenya around the constitutional referendum in the 2013 elections, and so have a bit of perspective on the what we saw today. The first thing that I want to say is that in Kenya, elections are not just about the president. And while the presidential election is an important election and raises a lot of important debate, Kenyans actually also deeply care about the elections of their MPs. And now with devolution, the situation has become increasingly complicated, and people are interested. We can talk about that a little bit more later on. And one of the things that we see that's actually been very stable in Kenya is the real problem of actual primary elections. This is a widespread issue across African elections that has until recently actually not received very much academic treatment. There's been a bit of work that's started to emerge on Ghana on the issue, and there's a recent piece that came out of democratization about Kenya, but it's not been widely studied. And one of the things that's interesting about these elections is that constituencies, except for urban constituencies, tend to, particularly rural constituencies, tend to be ethnic strongholds. And therefore, often, since the parties are generally associated with ethnic groups, though the Luya area is always one that raises issues in this regard, often primaries determine who is going to win the election. And so what happens there is then the contest actually goes to the primary. The primary becomes of utmost importance. And this recent article in Democratization highlights something which I saw in a lot of interview work and discussions with folks on the ground, is that those regulations are poorly institutionalized, which means that there are, until recently, almost no rules around how they would be carried out. And now there are some rules, but they're actually not very well enforced. They're a little bit more enforced in Ghana, is my understanding. And so what that means is that there are all kinds of trickery and strategy has to occur at this at this first stage of the process, because the first stage of the process will often determine who's going to win the election. And so if you talk, I spent a bunch of time in 2014 interviewing Kenyan MPs, and they're very interested in talking with. It's very interesting to talk to them about the strategies they use to actually combat these type of the potential for fraud at this level. And so they have to think very strategically about having teams of people to actually man or all of the polling stations for the primaries, which themselves are sometimes very poorly defined and can change at the last minute in unusual ways. And so one of the things that happened when I was talking with Professor Cheeseman last night is that this is actually ability to control primaries has actually led to varying levels of trust or distrust in parties, because what used to be ODM and is now NASA has had less success or potentially purposefully been less able to control their primary process, which has led to more problems, and including violence at the primary level. And this, in some ways, is potentially a lower turnout, maybe a cause for lower turnout, which then may have ended up decreasing the vote share for India. Some of the things that a lot of discussions about why turnout, particularly for ODM or NASA, has been low. So I think something for those of you who are students of African politics, an area to really study further is this issue of primary elections, because it's something that hasn't received enough attention and has actually seen a lot of stability over time. We haven't seen that those processes change very much over time. And so I think that was true in the 2018 election, the recent elections, just as it was in previous elections. So another, and well, the biggest thing that hasn't changed is that if you listen to focus groups and talk about opinions, they say anything is possible. So we never know what's going to happen next, and it's very hard to make certain predictions because people are actually very willing to change sides in ways that are potentially unexplainable. I don't think very few people would have thought that Ruto and Kenyatta would be together if you would talk to people some years before the election. The other thing that has remained constant is something that I'm working a little bit on now, which is this idea of whether the problems with the elections we see are related to bureaucratic incompetence or strategic fraud. It is very, very hard to distinguish between a lot of this in the Kenyan context. Working with a graduate student of mine at McGill and a co-author, we've actually taken all of the 2013 election petitions and digitized them and have them in kind of text analysis software. We've also coded them for all of the different types of fraud that were made in the claims themselves. And what it turns out preliminarily is that actually most of the claims that people made are made about bureaucratic irregularities. Now there are other kinds of claims, but the great majority of them are made, so-and-so didn't sign the form properly, the form wasn't dated properly, the numbers weren't added up properly. And these types of things could be conscious efforts to create a fraudulent outcome of the election to favor one side or the other. Or they simply could be misadministration on the part of election officials. And forensically, it's actually very hard to tell which one is going on. You can identify these cases, but to actually say, well, this is somebody trying to change the outcome versus this is someone who has simply not carried out to the letter of the law their bureaucratic responsibility is something that requires more theorizing and more data besides just the petition, the electoral tally sheets themselves. We actually have all the electoral tally sheets, which is a very interesting kind of way to study elections. And talk more about that in the Q&A if people want to hear more about that. And what's interesting in the petitions themselves is that the language that politicians use to talk about these irregularities is often this language of fraud. And the immediate assumption is that it is fraud. And it could very well be. But I think something that we need, and there has been quite a bit of theorizing done, but more work needs to be done to figure out exactly how we conceive of these different types of problems more systematically. Because while as in our session yesterday, Professor Cheeseman raised that there's been an incredible degree of meritocracy put in within election administrations, that is, millions and millions and millions of foreign aid dollars in the Kenyan case have been put in to the IEBC to make it a more professional organization. Running elections when you have 33,000 polling stations in areas that are often very remote, still don't have cell phone service, where the population often have low levels of literacy, is not an easy undertaking. And the amount of just sheer bureaucratic organization that goes into such an undertaking, I think, is often not well appreciated. This is particularly the case because in many older democracies, elections had a history from the ground up, and there's very low levels of electoral administration. There'll be provincial electoral administration, and there will be even much lower levels of bodies that are used to running the elections. These are all run centrally. And so the idea is that all of this type of information about how to run election has to be transmitted from a very small central office. And I don't know the number. I used to know the number at one point. Thousands of people have to be trained, and it is very actually hard to train these people to do their jobs. To the extent that the law requires them, which is a lot of very kind of pedantic things that have to be done. And this, in many ways, reflects, I think, potentially what Professor Cheeseman will talk a little bit more about, which is some of the technological problems that came up in this election, where the technology is not, it has a lot of parts to it and a lot of moving parts. And so making all that work is a huge effort in human resources and human resource training. So that also has, I think, stayed the same to a large extent, though it's gotten much better over time in Kenya. In fact, there's been massive improvements in the quality of the elections over time. So for many people, I think many people were surprised that these elections were overturned because of those massive improvements. But another thing that has stayed the same is this issue of whether things are fraud or incompetence. A few words on public opinion polling and kind of discussions around data in the electoral context. We in Western democracies are used to hundreds of polls coming out with daily updates on the state of elections. This is not true in most developing democratic contexts. In fact, public opinion polling operations, though they have gotten much cheaper in many developing democracies, still on a per interview basis remain much more expensive to carry out in African contexts than they do almost anywhere else in the world, having done these in quite a few other countries. Part of the reason is that the geographies are challenging, transportation costs are high, particularly if you want to be do nationally representative samples. In Kenya, for example, if you want to include the northeastern part of the country, which is mainly inhabited by tribal groups of ethnic Somalis, you have to expend a great amount of money to reach those people because they're spread out over a very large area with very poor road infrastructure. This is also actually an interesting aside that I'll make for 1 second, that population has grown 3- to 4-fold. And in fact, they haven't released the Kenyan census. My knowledge has still not released it because of changes in the ethnic Somali population. And this is an increasing political and electoral issue as well, given the somewhat the balance of electoral power in Kenya. And so polls in Kenya can often serve as important signs or discussions. They often have one poll can often have much more power in terms of the public discourse than we would ever expect in an environment like Canada or the United States, because there are so few of them. And a lot of people were actually blame much of the violence in 2007 on this public opinion polling. I think some of that is misplaced. But so that's happening on the one hand. On the other hand, we have populations that are continually fairly isolated from this type of news. And there's been some nice work looking at in Ukambani, a part of Eastern Kenya that ODM Kenya, the Wiper Coalition was from, showing that the populations there actually have very different expectations about the outcome of the elections based on the media that they see. And so, on the one hand, there's a growing urbanization and worldliness of populations. We're discussing things like polling and global trends, and on the other hand, there are populations that are still quite isolated from that. So while that's changing, it's still a trend that has maintained over time, though there are movements. So I think that's another thing that's interesting to think about as we discuss the Kenyan elections and the Kenyan electoral context. Maybe the last thing I will say, and then I'll hand the floor over, is that I think another understudied thing and another dynamic that is important in the elections has become the increased differentiation between urban and rural elections. Because in urban communities, actually, it's a very interesting phenomenon about there are actually very high rates of inter-ethnic marriage in Kenya, particularly in the urban areas. And this is changing the kind of old way that machine politics has worked based on ethnic affiliation. It's in its infancy, but I think it's actually something for those of you who are looking for topics that are interesting to study in these types of contexts, is how that's actually changing the way people think and talk about elections. Because the urban environments tend to be much more heterogeneous than the rural environments, though, and the way that politics has been traditionally done as well. So maybe that's something that's changing, though it's changing quite slowly and maybe not as fast as other people have thought it might happen. This is becoming increasingly important because of some changes to Kenyan electoral districts. There was a huge debate in Kenya about how much malapportionment would be allowed. And what this means is all of the constituencies have to be the same size. And what is the case, certainly, and it still is the case in Kenya, is that urban voters are drastically underrepresented. And so this has implications for the way that politics are carried out. But as urban populations continue to grow, that type of underrepresentation it may come under continued pressure. And the type of campaigning that you have to do, going back to my first point, in these urban environments is actually quite different, because you have to build coalitions in ways that you don't have to build in rural areas. So I think these are all things that are important to think about when we think about Kenyan elections. They're not specific about the 2018 election. I'll leave that to Professor Cheeseman. I was not actually in Kenya at the time, so I feel not particularly well prepared to speak about the issue. But I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about any of these issues and any of the time I spent in Kenya. I also did a lot of work talking to MP, as I said, in 2014, talking to MPs about their electoral strategies and how they chose to campaign the way they campaign. So that I'll turn to more.
Thanks. Okay, I'm the fourth speaker out of four, so I've got to wake you up. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to predict election outcomes in Africa. That's the story you need to stay away from, and not being a special sandwich already. A little bit of background to make sure we're all on exactly the same page. So when we're talking about the presidential election, we're talking about essentially a two-horse race. On one side, we have Leander, he is the opposition leader. He's not just the opposition leader, he is the opposition leader par excellence. He's the son of the former opposition leader. He is the leader who has lost multiple elections. He rallies a support base who consider themselves to be, in general, people who have been historically marginalized, have not done as well, have not had a president in the country's history. That's the kind of, we had a sort of 2-second characterization of the opposition. The ruling party is led by Uhuru Kenyatta, as we've heard very eloquently, the son of the first president of the country. Uhuru means freedom, so his birth was named celebrating the freedom of the country. And he, in a sense, also has a dynastic relationship with Kenya's past, but not one of opposition and marginalization, rather one of power and critics would say, advantage. So we have, in a sense, 2 sets of cleavages here. One is a set of ethnic cleavages, which is often what we hear about, either leaders from the Luo community or Kenya's from the Kikuyu community. We would often tell this story as an ethnic story. But in some ways, as important as that, or more important than that, is the potential cleavage between haves and have-nots. On the have-not side, those communities that have never had a president that feel historically economically marginalized. On the have side, 2 communities, the Kikuyu and the Kenyan, both of whom have had a president in Kenya's recent history. Now, all of those simplistic divisions are, of course, oversimplifications, so we need to complicate them because it's not quite as simple as that. But to get us on the same page, that's what this election is about. And as in the last few elections in Kenya, it turns out that this election is going to be pretty close. Ever since 2007, Kenya has essentially had a form of politics that boils down to 2 large coalitions and fairly close elections. In 2007, we think that there was about 100,000 votes in it, one way or another. And many people think that the Leander won, and then they added the votes they needed to escape it back again. And in 2013, the gap was a bit bigger than that because the opposition fragmented. With the opposition coming back together in 2018, we knew it was going to be a close election. It was going to be 52-48, something like that. So this was always going to be close. Now, going into the election, we made 2 predictions. One was that the ruling party would win. 2, when I say we, I mean the research group that I work in. And 2, that we thought would be relatively low or moderate, but potentially sustained violence. This is not because we're geniuses, because of course that's exactly what happens. It's because there are certain patterns in African politics that make some of these things relatively easy to predict. So, for example, in my 2015 book, Democracy in Africa, where I talk about elections at a more overview stage, I show that 88% of elections in Africa that are contested by the sitting president are won by the sitting president, 88%. That means that when the sitting president contests the election, the opposition has a 12% chance of victory. So you don't have to be brilliant to suggest that most elections are going to be won by the ruling party. And of course, this is an election, like many elections, in which the ruling party has massive advantages of incumbency. That you might think about these as being sort of legitimate and illegitimate, right? So legitimate advantages of incumbency come from the fact that you're in power. If you're in power, you get more media for free. If you're in power, you're able to use being in power to structure policy in a way that coincides with the electoral cycle to reward your supporters. All of that is legitimate in the sense that it's done in democracies all around the world. But there are also illegitimate advantages of incumbency, and we see a number of those playing out in Kenya. On the one hand, censorship of the media, which has become an increasing problem more recently, probably critics of the government being sacked from newspapers, things like that. Government's control over the police and use of the police and other forces, the rule of law, to prevent the opposition from doing certain things they'd like to in terms of protest and so on. Government also, and it's alleged, we don't have the hard truth, but it seems very clear, especially from some of the statements of people in the Electoral Commission, government pressure and political pressure on the Electoral Commission, preventing it from doing some of the reforms that would have been needed to deliver a higher quality election and get that final part of the improvement in terms of delivering a really good process. So we had a sense that the ruling party would win, not because we were necessarily predicting that everybody in Kenya wanted to vote for the ruling party, but that given elections are very close and given that the political system tends to weight towards the ruling party, given a massive advantage anyway, it's going to be very, very difficult for an opposition party to win. And I think this is a really important point more generally. I've always estimated that for an opposition party to really win an election, by which I mean to be allowed to win by the ruling party, it needs to win by more than about 3 or 4% of the vote. Because less than 3 or 4% of the vote, they will find a way to keep you out. They will find the 100,000 votes they need to stick in. They will manage to rule out certain ballot boxes or polling stations. But when it gets above that, it gets difficult. And I have talked to some people who worked in electoral commissions in other countries, which I can't name, and they've recounted a fantastic conversation to me with a president who was losing the election, who phoned the electoral commission and said, how many votes am I behind? About 350,000. How many ballot box papers do we have? About 200,000, Mr. President. Oh, what do you suggest we do? It doesn't seem that we can do anything, Mr. President. Mr. President then gets a call from the US ambassador, gets a call from the former president, and in the end, Mr. President is no longer Mr. President. But the point is, he would have tried almost every trick in the book if he'd have thought he could get away with it. But the gap was simply too big. And I think if you go to Nigeria 2015, Zambia 2011, a lot of these elections, the presidents were ultimately surprised by the gap. The problem in a place like Kenya is if you win by a tiny margin, you create that window of opportunity at the end of the process for the ruling party to try and reverse it. And I think something like that happened in 2007. So one thing we know about that and that we can learn from the election is about the importance of incumbency and the power of incumbency and why we don't get more transfers of power in Africa. The second is, and I think this goes back to something that you were talking about very well, what do we mean by a free and fair election? So President Trump has just congratulated President Putin on his fantastic election victory, using a kind of language that basically states, well, if you win the most votes, you win the election, that's kind of legitimate. And the problem, of course, with that is that most elections are not rigged on the day. Most elections are not rigged by burning the ballots for the opposition. Most elections are rigged about 6 months in advance. And one of the things that we talk about in this new book, How to Rig an Election, is that only amateurs rig elections in the week before the polls, right? Anybody with any skill who knows what they're doing will do gerrymandering in advance to sort the boundaries of districts out so they favour the ruling party. They will exclude rival candidates. No one in Russia who covered the election, but the mainstream press has been talking about the fact that the most important candidates were not on the ballot paper because they were not allowed to run. The fact that you then control the media, that you then control political finance, that you then control the police. So by the time you get to election day, you can actually allow people to vote freely because it doesn't matter how they vote because you've registered twice as many of your supporters as the opposition in any case. And so there's two very different versions of what it means to have a free and fair election. One is were people allowed to cast their ballots on polling day and does the result reflect the ballots that were cast? And one is do you actually have a free and fair context in which there can be meaningful competition? Russia may have had a decent election in terms of the ballots cast, or even there we see ballot box stuff in video circulating on YouTube. But it certainly didn't have a free and fair election if you actually think about the 2 or 3 months. And I think then when it comes to Kenya, we then have to be very careful. So what happened around the election was that we had a significant number of issues in terms of bureaucratic processes, the kind of issues that we were talking about. And again, as ever, it raises this question. Is this bureaucratic incompetence or is it manipulation designed to look like bureaucratic incompetence because that's the easiest way to get away from it? The government's argument was, well, we won because we did get most of the votes that were actually cast on the day. The opposition's argument was, we don't really buy that. We don't buy that all of these mistakes and all of these problems, the fact that some of the forms didn't come in, we don't buy that that was innocent. We think that was deliberate and it was designed to hide rigging. But also, even if we agreed with you that you passed more ballots on the day, what about all of the things that had happened in the 2 or 3 weeks before the election that allowed you to do this? And those would be things like I talked about media censorship, but also things that happen, and again, it's very hard to attach them to anyone because they're done in a way that makes it very difficult to link them to any particular actor, but clearly have an impact on the conduct of the polls. The most important of those in Kenya in this case was the death, the torture, and murder of the acting ICT director, Cheeseman, who was killed in the week running up to the elections. So this is an election that by the time you get to polling day, the opposition knows that one of the few people that really trusted in the electoral commission has been tortured and murdered in the run-up to the polls. Now, the opposition will say that was done by a faction of the ruling party who knew that he was going to be one of the people in the electoral commission who, if there was rigging, he would have pulled it out, and that's why he had to be killed. The government, of course, says, well, who knows who killed somebody in a place like Nairobi? Maybe it was something to do with a jilted lover. Maybe it was something to do with some sort of background deal. We'll do a good police investigation, and we're very sorry, but we can assure you that it wasn't us. So you go into the election not being able to prove that, but with that culture of suspicion amongst the opposition that we are not contesting an election, we're going to be allowed to So that's something on rigging and the complexities of actually detecting rigging. Now, there are a number of things that I think the election tells us is really important, and this comes back to you mentioning the 50% clause in the new constitution. Kenyan politics is ethnic politics, but more importantly than that, it's coalition politics. You can't win an election without piecing together 4 or 5 communities. And actually, you think about the size of most ethnic groups in Kenya, the size of most groups is somewhere between 10 and 20%. Right? So actually, to get over 50%, even if it's a pure ethnic calculus, and I'll explain in a minute why it's not, but even if it is, you're going to need 2 or 3 groups to get over the 50% as a presidential candidate. So this isn't simply about ethnic politics as in you can rally your ethnic group and you can win. You have to rally your ethnic group in a way that allows you to rally 2 or 3 other ethnic groups, and you have to form that alliance. And the potential for opposition victory and the potential for violence is shaped to a great degree by the nature of those alliances. So why in 2017 did we think the prospects of really widespread violence were contained? But there had been violence in 2007. We thought the ruling party would win, we thought the election might be more political. Partly because of the alliance structure. The 2 groups in Kenya and the 2 sets of leaders that have often been rumoured and alleged, because we're being recorded, to be involved in ethnic violence, sit within the ruling party. So going into an election, you know that one of the country's historical violence flashpoints, the Rift Valley, actually all of the key leaders, or most of the key leaders from that area, are sitting within the same alliance for the government. And so our assumption was simply that they would have an interest, a vested interest, in downplaying and demobilizing the potential for violence because they were on the same side. Now that's really important because when we think about the potential for Kenya in the future to have incidents of election violence, what we're saying is we will avoid those whilst the current set of coalition partners holds. But if you explode these current coalitions so that actually those leaders who are right now on the same side and have an interest in demobilizing that tension end up on opposite sides and might gain an incentive in ratcheting up that tension, all of a sudden you could be returning to something like a 2007-8 context. So it's very important not to assume just from where we are now things will be the same in the future, particularly as you were saying, Kenyan politics is so unpredictable. So after months and months of dispute, after months and months of rivalry, when it finally looks like Kenyan politics has kind of broken down into these 2 factions that will never agree, Odinga is still saying we're not a legitimate president, Kenyatta is saying why can't we get to the program and just accept that I won. We have months of protests. All of a sudden, from out of nowhere, we get a deal signed by the 2 of them that they are now brothers and they are going to work together for the interest of Kenya. And what does that do? It upsets all of the people who were formerly alliance partners of these 2 guys who were saying, hang on a minute, we were fighting with you against that guy. You said we had to be with you. You said we had to do this and that. Our supporters have been beaten up all over the country as a result of this campaign. And now you 2 are going to stand there together and shake hands and call each other brothers and sign a deal. What about all of us? And so there's now a possibility, and it's only a possibility, that we'll have a massive political reconfiguration in which those 2, or some manifestation of the allies of those 2, will form a new political front, a new coalition. And some of the others will now have to form a new coalition, and that process will trigger a rift within the opposition and the ruling party that will bring into play ethnic grievances, tensions, and potential violence that we didn't see in the last election, but might be much more dangerous and return us to that 2007. The other thing I really wanted to talk about is the fact that I think there was a key moment in Kenyan politics that made Kenyan political life much more contentious. And it's the period that leads from around about 2002 to 2007. And I think 2 things happened in that period that are really important. The first thing that happens is we see a breakdown of what I think was a reasonably effective elite pact within the country to demobilize challenges to the status quo. And I think one of the things we don't talk about enough in African politics is class. Not class in a kind of classic Marxist sense, but class in the sense of elites looking after themselves. And there's loads of great literature in Kenya in every decade about how elite pacts have basically stitched the elites up back together after a dispute. And almost every fight you see the elite reconfiguring itself effectively to protect the political system, which actually benefits elites of all ethnic groups. So you don't have redistribution of wealth, you cut off the trade unions, you don't actually allow for the kind of progressive politics that might change some of those things to come from below, because all of the elites have an interest and a willingness to demobilize that and stop that rising. And I think one of the things that happened in 2006-07 is that elite practice broke. All of a sudden, people are willing not only to not suppress that, but to actually harness it against each other. And that transforms the nature of Kenyan politics from an elite that's demobilizing these challenges to the status quo to one that is potentially going to harness them. And I think that helps to explain why that 2007 election was quite so dangerous as a threat. Because it wasn't just a threat in terms of ethnic leaders doing battle, it was a threat in terms of the challenge to actually the nature of the state and the form of state that existed before. But the second thing that happens around then, partly in the lead up to the 2002 election, but also 2007, is we get this shift in Kenyan politics to big coalitions. So the elections of the 1990s, the opposition fragmentation, and President Moi wins against the fragmented opposition. In 2002 and afterwards, we start to get these very broad opposition coalitions, broad ruling party coalitions, and almost every election is kind of two coalitions against each other. And this does two things. One, it means that almost every election ends up being on an knife edge. It ends up being a 52-48% election. So you don't go into the election with people really willing to say, oh, it's a slam dunk, he's won by 2/3, go on. Every election has that tense build up. But in the context of that, then you have this other trend, which is that all of a sudden these forces from below are not necessarily being demobilized. And that combination is a potential source of political instability. On the one hand, forces from below that are disrupted being harnessed. On the other hand, a consistently very close set of very controversial elections. It's the interaction of those two things that makes Kenyan politics so volatile. So to end, I want to say something about how you win an election. So I've talked about the fact that this is a ruling party that has lots of advantages. This is a ruling party that clearly understands how to win elections, how to run good campaigns, and they understand all sorts of effective strategies that we've seen Cambridge Analytica talk about recently. As some of you will know, Cambridge Analytica were there in Kenya advising the Jubilee government on its campaign. Strategies such as demonizing opposition candidates, making people think that opposition candidates are going to be a force of division, they're going to ruin the country, they're going to undermine infrastructure, generating that kind of suspicion and fear about what might happen in the opposition. But there's something else going on here at the same time, and I think one of the things we don't always look at is the organizational underpinnings of effective electoral mobilization. So in the last election in Kenya, for all of the talk of the election rigging and everything else, which is true, much of it is true, some of it isn't. But one of the things that happened that people are not talking about enough is the actual organization of the campaigns. On the NASA side, so the National Super Alliance under Leander, we saw a much more integrated and effective campaign than before because some of the leaders who left in 2013 came back to the fold and that gave it a renewed momentum. And in the primaries, to decide the party leader, they managed to keep everybody together. So we didn't lose anybody in that process of forming the party leadership. Often you'll see the losing leader go off and fight in the election under a different party banner. But that didn't happen this time round. But NASA wasn't able to integrate all of its different parties into a common structure. So everybody signed up to Leander as the presidential candidate, but they didn't sign up to a common set of MPs, a common set of county governors, a common set of members of the county assembly that everybody would back in every position. Jubilee did. So Jubilee went from a coalition to a party. It integrated a set of different parties into a common set of candidates, and NASA didn't match. And I think one of the key differences, if you look at some of the sub-national elections, that may have helped Jubilee win some of those seats, is that they weren't fighting candidates against each other. They picked a set of candidates and they ran them and they invested in them and they were able to concentrate much more. And this is really important. If you go back to 2007, Kibaki takes a bit of a beating in Parliament as well as nationally. The opposition actually win many seats in Parliament and get control of the Speaker's position as a result of their success in the elections. Parliamentary elections are very close. And I think one of the reasons for that was, again, that at that time, Kibaki was leading a coalition of parties, and they were running candidates against each other, dividing the votes in lots of different areas. The fact that they didn't do that this time round, the new incarnation of that, the new ruling party, gave them an advantage in many of these other elections. And I think we don't always think about that side of it, right? How was the organization structured? How effective were they? But the other thing that's important to say, and I think this is what I'll end on, is that look, you don't get the vote of your ethnic community just like that. Right? You have to earn and win the vote of your ethnic community. Now, there are two or three ways you can do that. You can do that by showing that you have solidarity with your community, you are one with them, and earning it that way. You can do it through fear, what John Lonsdale would call political tribalism. You can do it by demonizing the other side so much that your own community feel they have to turn out for you. You can do it through putting forward really good policies that speak to your community, that are things that your community really wants to listen to. You can do it through being a credible leader and consistently delivering for your community over time. But you actually have to do some of these things, right? If you don't do them, if you're not seen as being credible, it actually can completely undermine your opportunity to win election. And this is very clear in Kenya from Musalia Mudavadi's career. It's worth spending just a moment on his career. So this is a guy who's now supposedly within the Odinga alliance, although of course we don't know what the Odinga alliance means anymore. We don't know if NASA continues to exist after this agreement between the president and Odinga. But he was the one who went in 2013. He said, I can't be with Ryder anymore. Many people assumed it was because he hadn't been given enough credit and authority. He felt that he wasn't bringing anything home to his own supporters from supporting Odinga's presidency. So he stood on his own. But his process of starting on his own was rather complicated. First of all, it looked like he was actually going to do a deal with Kenyatta, that he might be the front candidate for Kenyatta's alliance. This was in the context of the International Criminal Court proceedings against Kenyatta and himself. Some people on that side of the political spectrum said it would be a really good idea if we weren't fronting people who are at The Hague on charges of crimes against humanity in a presidential election. So let's bring Mudavadi over and he can be the poster boy for the campaign and we'll be the power behind the throne. But just before the election actually happened, Kenyatta had a change of heart. He had a wonderful press conference when he talked about the devil having made him sign the contract, and the contract therefore being illegitimate with Mudavadi, or the agreement, ripped the agreement up, and Mudavadi then didn't have any vehicle to go with, so had to create his own vehicle and stand on his own and became the third wheel, the third leg of the election. In that election, Mudavadi, whose community comprises well over 10% of the Kenyan population, polled 3.9% of the vote. Why? Because lots of people in his own community said, you don't have any credibility here. Right? You're a stooge for the ruling party, you are willing to sell everybody out by jumping over there. Now you're coming to us and saying that you're one with us and you're representing us as one of our brothers. How do we know who you are? How do we know that you're not just a puppet of the state house? So building up your credibility as a leader to your community is really important. And that building up the community isn't simply about being ethnic, right? Because there's going to be lots of different leaders who are of your ethnicity competing for the same votes. So when you're competing in that way, you can't simply campaign on the basis of ethnicity. You have to be delivering something else. And one of the things that Leander has been very effective at over the years is connecting with his supporters, making them feel that he genuinely suffers their pain, that he genuinely is with them, and that he would genuinely deliver if he were to win the election. And that's important because one of the things that is shaping these election outcomes is turnout. And so I know that I'm going to get 90% of the Kikuyu vote if I'm the main Kikuyu candidate. You know you're going to get 90% of the Luo vote if you're the Luo candidate. But if your supporters are fed up or disenchanted and they don't show up to the polls, it's going to have just as bad an effect on your election chances as if the swing voting and I can get some of you guys to come over. And this is where the primaries come. If you run primary elections that are so corrupt and so undemocratic that they kill the popularity of the party in the region, you can undermine people's willingness to turn out, even though there's no way they would vote for the other guys. And so I think we need to understand these elections as this complex mix. Ethnicity is important, but so is credibility, so is your history, so is coalition building, and all of that is what you actually need to be able to pull off in order to win. Now, what some of you might be interested in, seeing as it was a really big story, is exactly how rigged the election was and exactly how we should interpret the Supreme Court's verdict that the election should be nullified. And this is really difficult, because what the Supreme Court said was there are clear procedural irregularities. You have not, Electoral Commission, you have not allowed us the access that we have requested. You have not allowed us to see your servers or your logs in the way that we wanted. There are lots of questions that we don't feel are fully answered. There are things going on with the use of passwords of people in the Electoral Commission that don't seem to fit the process. And we have these missing forms that were never actually delivered properly on time by the time the election result was delivered. And so we're going to rule that that election was null and void on the basis that it was illegal. Now that's a really interesting decision because it's a different decision to say one guy won more than the other. It doesn't require you to know who won the most votes. It's a verdict that says the election was not free and fair because it didn't meet constitutional legal parameters. It's not a verdict that says we know one guy won more than the other because we found 200,000 votes stuck down the sofa and we know that actually we added them this time we won. And there are two reasons that's really interesting. Right? One, it sets a legal precedent that is far more striking than a lot of people realized at the time. This was not just the first time a court in Africa had ruled against the election of a sitting president. It was much more than that. It was an assertion that you could rule an election illegal even if you cannot be fully sure who won the election. Right? So they were saying, we don't have to know that Leander won the election to rule this election was not good. That's quite a striking standard. But it also is really striking because, of course, it sets up a tension within Kenya itself. And Leander supporters interpret that result to mean the election was rigged, we won the election, we therefore should have been given the presidency, so the current state of affairs is inherently illegitimate. Kenyatta should not be president. Kenyatta's argument would be what the court said was that the election was not good enough, but it didn't find me culpable as a candidate, and therefore I then contested the rerun election. I won that with a big vote, so I am now the legitimate president of Kenya. And the fact that, in a way, that Supreme Court verdict can be interpreted in these multiple ways, but the Supreme Court ruled in this very specific way, is something that I think is going to cause long-running problems. Because by the time we get to the next election, Odinga supporters, unless he's with Kenyatta in the deal, will once again be saying, we actually won the last election and we should have been in power for the last 4 years. So this will build into the narrative of marginalization that's going on. At the same time, the Supreme Court has a really difficult decision to make. Next time round, when we get the presidential election, is it going to follow the same protocols and standards it applied this time round? Which is, we don't have to know who won the election, we have to know that the standards were not met to an adequate degree. And that's really important because that's a very different standard than most of us use when we talk about electoral fraud, to go back to what I started. So when international election monitors go into a country, they're very unlikely to declare that an election was rigged unless they have a good sense the opposition candidate might have won without the rigging. Most of the time, if they know there's 10% rigging but the opposition won by 30%, they're going to sit on their hands. They'll put that at the back of the report, but they're not going to lead on it because why cause all that trouble if you think the right person won anyway? So the Kenyan court, in making a decision that basically said you don't need to know who won to be able to say the election was invalid, is actually setting a much higher threshold and standard than the election observers were. And so that's why the election observers said the election was okay, and the court then ruled it illegal. But that leaves open a really interesting question, going back to your point about can we distinguish rigging from bureaucratic errors, which is it feasible in the next election to get an election that is so high quality that it actually passes that threshold that the Supreme Court has now set, which is a much tougher threshold for an election to pass than the one that the election observers actually used. So, in a way, the election, like almost all elections in Kenya, leaves us with more questions than answers. Is Odinga now with Kenyatta? What happens to all of Odinga's complaints during the campaign? What happens to poor Christmas Ando and his family? We still have no justice for him. What happens to the Kenyan media, which is being censored if we now see a relationship between the opposition and the ruling party? What does this mean in terms of electoral reform? Do we need a new electoral commission? Does it need to have new individuals given the nullification of the election? And where does this leave the Supreme Court? They've taken an awful lot of critical criticism from the ruling party, but nullifying the first election. But they've also set this really tough threshold and standard that in some ways they will be expected to uphold in subsequent elections. And those are the kind of questions I think that will play out over the next few years.